What is it about music that can transform your ordinary life into something extraordinary? What is it about music that can touch us so deeply and set in motion the wheel of our emotions? Whether we celebrate each other, nature, or the divine, our desire to express ourselves through music is ancient and a cultural universal. In this program, we will explore music from all over the world and speak with guests from musical, spiritual, scientific, and other realms in a quest to share and understand how music affects us. I'm your host, BRAUN, and this is Soulscapes. We live in troubled times, surrounded by conflict, clashes, and dissonance, great and small. Despite our technological and other advances, our negotiation and peace-building efforts continue to fall short. Can music and the arts transform how we think about and approach conflict? My guest today is an internationally recognized interdisciplinary scholar in the field of conflict transformation, arts, and resilience. She is a peace weaver on a pilgrimage to discover the unique ways in which humans make meaning and share worldviews, using creativity to build bridges across troubled waters. Michelle Lebaron, welcome to Soulscapes.
Thank you so much, Adi. It's my great pleasure to be here.
Well, let's bridge the divide of me being here in Toronto and you in Vancouver, and we're just in the wonderful now of our conversation.
I'm looking forward to it.
I'm going to dive right in. If I say music, you say any words or thoughts that come to mind.
Alchemy, harmony, resonance. And then I also think of the wonderful Irish scholar and singer Noreen Narian's idea of theosophy, that we can listen with the ear of the heart.
Oh, wow. I have to take a deep breath after that. Those are wonderful words, wonderful, wonderful words. And we will obviously come back to music again, but I always like to start with early beginnings when I speak with my guests so that we can all sort of take a refresher course into the past, as it were. You were born around Lethbridge, Alberta. What was it like growing up in the prairies?
This is a very interesting question. I did live there for the first 17 years of my life, and it was only after leaving Adi that I began to see that the prairies were kind of like the sea that I had always longed for growing up. All the waving grain and the wind rippling the grasses. But as I was growing up, I didn't realize that, and so I did long for the sea. I was surrounded by music growing up. It was country music. My parents got a fancy high fidelity stereo when I was young, and this was a great innovation according to them, and they played constant country music, which I developed a strong aversion to. It was only later, as I began to spend a lot of time in Ireland, that I realized that that country music was actually a derivative of traditional Irish music, and I began to be able to enjoy it more than I had when growing up in the southern part of Alberta.
Why do you think it is? You know, a lot of people, we tend to want to fly the nest, find our own, travel the world, and more often than not, people return to the place that they were born in. What do you think that connection is?
I think that the soil and the place gets into our bones and we feel a belonging to it. Although I'm not often back in Alberta these days, when I go there, I can feel a kind of ancestral belonging to the land there, both sets of my grandparents were homesteaders and created farms in the Dust Bowl of southern Alberta in the 1920s, 1930s. And there is something there that stirs my soul. I would say, and we'll talk more about Ireland, I'm sure, in this
Hmm.
conversation, Addie, but I would say that going to Ireland and spending a lot of time there as I do really taught me something about belonging to the land. And although my people don't have nearly the length of history that many people I know in Ireland do to the Irish land, still, those decades and well over a century now of connection really do create a bond that is wordless. It's very difficult to explain, and yet it's very tangible.
Makes perfect sense. Now, you mentioned before that you were surrounded by country music, but I wanted to ask you, how were music and art, let's just focus on music for a second, part of your growing up years in terms of you maybe playing an instrument or attending a church or going to concerts, being part of a choir, any of these?
I had that inclination. It was not until I was 13 that I was given a piano, and then I practiced so much that my mother asked me to please stop, especially because I tended to play a lot of scales and arpeggios. Um, there was no symphony in Lethbridge, Alberta, and I missed it, even though I didn't really know what it was. And I found the church music to which I was exposed a bit too much in a major key with 4/4 time. I felt that that was not something that touched my soul, although I hadn't really experienced music that touched my soul until later.
I have to say, though, your mother, um, clearly she hadn't heard of the saying that practice makes perfect. How dare she interrupt you?
Clearly not. She was so happy when I began to play piano, and then it just all became a bit too much. Yes.
Mm. So, where did life take you after high school? Did you remain in Lethbridge, or did you have an itch and a yearn to do something else?
No, I left at 17 and never
Oh.
lived there again. I moved to California where I did my bachelor's degree initially in music and then shifting to communication and psychology at Chapman University, which is south of Los Angeles. And from there, I traveled around the world by ship on a university ship and went to law school after that in Vancouver. So staying as near the sea as possible.
What's a university ship?
A university ship in this case was semester at sea. It was
Oh.
accredited by the University of Pittsburgh, and professors and about 500 students, mostly from US America, sailed around the world. And we took classes when at sea, and we went on excursions when in port related to various of our educational endeavors.
That is completely brilliant. So you saw a lot of sights, you smelled a lot of things, you touched a lot of things that people your age did not at that point, right?
That is true, and I heard a lot of music. I was exposed to music in many, many different parts of the world, and that was truly fabulous as a part of that experience, which was mind-opening and heart-opening in every way.
Oh, so at what point in your life did you realize that you were drawn to study to or to explore the area of conflict? Did you early on think you might have a calling, if one can even say that, as someone who seeks peace or is interested in peace building?
When I was in kindergarten,
Hmm.
my kindergarten teacher, who was a visionary woman named Dorothy Gentleman, Dorothy kept me after kindergarten one day to teach me to use chopsticks because she said that I would need them since I would be having an international career. And so I've been deeply thankful to Auntie Dorothy for that all of my
Oh,
life. I did have a sense I would have an international career. And I also, while growing up in southern Alberta, really felt very uncomfortable by the divisions that were in my midst. Indigenous people were on the margins of the city and were subject to horrific racism. The Japanese had been interned not long before, and
Oh.
therefore were still very much living under a cloud and not able to return to the coast and their homes, from which many of them had been taken until the mid 1950s. And Chinese, who had been subject to a head tax, also were not a part of an integrated society. I don't know if you know, but in the early 1900s, the Alberta government, in its wisdom, passed a law saying that people of African or Caribbean origin would not be able to homestead in southern Alberta because they were of a more delicate constitution and would not be able to withstand the winters. So there weren't any folks who were Black. And
That is
growing
dumbfounding.
up in this deeply divided society with all of the people of color marginalized was deeply troubling to me. And I did feel as though I wanted to do something in the world that would address that.
A sense that something wasn't right, or maybe even a degree of fairness missing, a big degree of fairness missing, right? Yeah. I'm really fascinated by etymology and where words come from. And I grew up in Germany and took Latin for quite a while. So, of course, when I am thinking of conflict, I needed to research that word again. And it comes from confligere, which means to fly towards each other, to strike together, and to collide. So it seems that conflict is as old as time itself. And for most of us, myself included, the word has more negative connotations than not, and is perhaps even something that one should avoid. How do you see conflict, and what is its purpose?
In the conflict field, for conflict scholars and practitioners, Adi, we often are saying that conflict is an opportunity for change. It's an opportunity for learning, and it's a lovely theory. The problem is that most of us, when we experience conflict, do not experience it as an
Right.
opportunity for learning or for positive change. Indeed, neurophysiologically, we tend to seize up, we tend to back up, we have the fight, flight, or freeze response because we know from our long human history that actually conflict can be dangerous. And so the field of conflict studies, conflict transformation, has really been around for 75 years or so as a field. Of course, ways of engaging conflict have been around as long as humans have been around, but as a field of study, it's relatively new. And our work has really been to coax people into befriending conflict, to say, yes, conflict can be threatening, it can certainly be difficult. And there are ways for us to think about it and to meet it that might help lessen the pain, might help lessen the suffering that's necessarily for many of us involved in engaging or confronting conflict. I would say that conflict is a difference that matters.
Hmm.
We all have all sorts of differences in our midst, and many times they don't matter at all. When you're out walking in Toronto, you encounter many people with many differences, as I do here in Vancouver, and we don't even notice them necessarily. Conflict happens when a difference begins to matter, a difference over what you and I want or need, a difference over our vision for the neighborhood, a difference over our vision for the country, for how we work together, for how we relate to each other. Then conflict becomes more difficult. And I would say also that conflict is tied to our identities, to our worldviews. So these things are largely out of conscious awareness, and therefore conflict can surprise us.
Mm, beautiful, thoughtful response to this. And before I ask you, how do you see your role in conflict? For most people, again, I'm just saying for myself as well, it's very interesting because we tend to think that things have to be black or white, either or, win or lose. I'm so tired of that metaphor. And I believe, from what I've read about you and the bit I've gotten to know you, that that is a very old modality that does not necessarily hold truth and shouldn't be spearheaded. So the sports, as much as we love sports, those metaphors sometimes are more damaging than not. So how do you see your role in this word conflict, in this, what could we call it, this situation, this encounter, that people have?
Well, my role, as my first two books would have indicated, is as a bridge. I think that very often when we get ourselves tied in the knots of conflict, we need someone else to help us. Maybe that's a friend we just speak to who helps us get a different perspective. Maybe that is someone that we go to for advice or support. Maybe it's an arts practice, and I hope we'll talk more about that because what we know about arts practices is that they help us see nuance. They help us see all sorts of levels and different possibilities. You, as a musician, Adi, I'm sure, would know that if I were to talk to you about song interpretation, and I said, there's only this way or that way to interpret this song, you would find that very difficult to imagine because there are so many different ways to interpret a song, and those ways will have a very different effect on those who hear the song performed. And so I think that metaphors from arts, metaphors from movement, from journeying, are much more helpful than the three most common metaphors that were identified years ago by the United States Institute of Peace as governing a lot of negotiation and conflict work. And what they did is they identified war and sports
Mm-hmm.
and Christian religion as the source of a lot of polarized metaphors. The idea that you're saved or not, that you are a sinner or not a sinner from Christian religion. And of course, we know the metaphors from war and from sports. You win or you don't. You eliminate the other side, ideally in war.
Right.
And of course, we know that this is not a metaphor that we want to govern our thinking about conflict.
Mm. Well, because you mentioned the arts, and I know it's very close to your heart, you've written numerous articles and books. But in addition to these scholarly collaborations, you have been very engaged in hands-on arts-based collaborations with others. And two great artists come to mind that you have collaborated with, and I'd love for you to share what that was like and what you all did. Dancer Margie Gillis and visual artist Kim Berman, who's from South Africa.
Thank you. I'd love to talk about the work with both of them because the two places and the two pieces of work that have really left deep impressions on me are work in South Africa, where Dr. Kim Berman is a professor of visual art at the University of Johannesburg, and then also Switzerland and Ireland, so various work in European sites. The work with Margie Gillis was astonishing, Adi, because Margie, as you know, based in Montreal and a very, very long career as a performer and a choreographer and an animator of all
Hmm.
things movement, um, began when I met her at Hollyhock, which is a retreat and education center on the West Coast here, and asked her if she would work with me with a group of mediators. Margie immediately agreed. She's a very energetic and warm and visionary person. And Margie and I, along with our colleague Carrie McLeod, who's faculty at the European Graduate School, developed together a series of exercises that helped translate conflict into physical experience. And what we felt was that if we could gather groups of mediators, which we did at the European Graduate School in Switzerland, and help them notice how conflict lives in their bodies, how conflict shifts in their bodies, how conflict can move through us and change and be dynamic even as we're in its midst. That if we could have these physical experiences of increasing our proprioception and our awareness of the physicality of ourselves and others in conflict, then we could be more effective as mediators, as bridges for people in conflict. And so we spent a glorious week in the Swiss Alps in a dance studio, moving with Margie every morning, and then discussing every afternoon, so what are the implications of this work we've done in the studio for our practice? And after we had concluded that work, we did a book called The Choreography of Resolution, which is all about movement and conflict and what a group of experienced mediators learned about themselves and about working well with conflict through movement, led by Margie Gillis.
I'm just trying to visualize what that would be like. And I am sure if mediators have not been exposed to that kind of physicalization, it might have been even a bit awkward at the beginning, right?
It certainly was. In fact, there were lots of jokes about men, especially who participated, needing to acquire a tutu, and they came into the space deeply uncomfortable. I felt that it was important to have a group who were half men and half women because both of those groups need this work. And it seemed important to have that gender balance. So we did, and certainly the men from the very first day were deeply uncomfortable, but they very quickly were coaxed into more comfort. Some of our participants were from Europe. One was a Swiss diplomat, and the Swiss diplomat, along with some of his other colleagues from ETH University in Zurich, later convened a follow-up workshop with Margie Gillis.
Wonderful.
So many of the participants found it enormously helpful, not least me. I found that it really transformed my thinking about conflict and my ways of working with conflict.
I mean, the curious thing about conflict, we can think of it as an external thing, but the problem starts with the fact that we are at war, to use that stupid metaphor. We are conflicted within ourselves. So when that is the basis, and then you go into more conflicted situations, there's a lot of work to be done. So what did it look like to go from a physicalized dance situation to working with Professor Kim Berman? Obviously, there's physicality in that too, but describe how that worked.
Dr. Kim Berman moved back to South Africa before apartheid was over to try to assist with the struggle of overturning apartheid. She is from a Jewish South African family. Her father was a well-known lawyer. She brought to me a concept that many of your listeners will be familiar with, Ubuntu, which is the idea that I am through you and you are through me. That is, we are materially interdependent. And once we realize that, then we have a different eye as we perceive how to address the very deeply unjust dynamics in any society. Dr. Kim Berman brought that eye and that sensitivity to her work in South Africa. And we held a number of international fora about how arts have created and supported and helped sustain social change. So we had writers and theater directors and visual artists and musicians from many parts of Africa, Europe, and North America who came together to tell stories, to have experiences of working using arts practices ourselves, and then created a book that you've referred to, Changing Our Worlds, Art as Transformative Practice. And I would say that one of the most exciting projects that Kim Berman did was during the time when HIV/AIDS was rampant in South Africa,
Mm.
and the then president of the country refused to acknowledge that HIV/AIDS was being transferred through sexual conduct, and therefore um, was resistant to receiving antiretroviral drugs in the country. At that point, Kim, who had returned from living in the US, wanted to do something to address HIV/AIDS in rural communities all over South Africa. But she also knew that there was a taboo of talking about sexuality or talking about birth control in these communities. And therefore, she started paper making collectives in these various South African communities.
Brilliant.
Started a project called Pumani Paper. And in these various paper making collectives, which then added to community development and self sufficiency in these various communities who were often very depressed economically, um, people began to care about and actually pursue learning about their HIV status, which previously had not happened. And so, even in the midst of a lack of antiretroviral drugs in South Africa, the paper-making collectives, which were created in every province of the country, supported people, often mainly women, but also some men, to begin to normalize learning their HIV status and then being able to work together to support members of communities where there had been a great deal of loss given HIV/AIDS transmission in South Africa at that time.
That's a mind-blowing story on so many levels. You mentioned, as we were talking about your work with Kim Berman, you mentioned music, of course. And so naturally, I'm going to ask you whether music is part of your teaching. And I had this thought to ask you, perhaps you've done it, perhaps you haven't. Had you thought of working with, let's say, a very fluid choir director to bring voice into this whole situation? Because, well, I'm thinking you carry the instrument with you. You don't have to rent anything anywhere. Had you ever thought of anything like that?
Adi, I have worked with a very wonderful vocal artist named Dr. Hussein Jan Mohammed, who is from here on the West Coast, although he did his PhD not too long ago at the University of Toronto. And when Hussein was in Toronto working on his PhD, he came often to classes that I've taught at the Osgood Masters of Law program
Right.
and worked with my class around resonance, around harmony, around singing together in rounds.
Mm.
And I will tell you, when Hussein would come to my class, it was very similar to some of the participants coming to the dance studio where we
Mm.
worked with Margie Gillis. They were anything but enthusiastic and made comments such as, I don't sing. I can't carry a tune. I can't do this. What on earth does this have to do with conflict and negotiation? And yet, they often remarked in the class evaluations that the work with Hussein Jan Mohammed was the most moving of the entire course. And so I have loved doing that. I haven't done enough of it, but I do know that the voice that we carry with us, and indeed our entire bodies, are resources in conflict. And if we think, as too many people do, especially in the academy, that we can solve conflict from the neck up, we are sadly mistaken.
Mm. Very, very good words indeed. You have traveled extensively and taught all over the world. Tell us about some of the most exciting projects you have been involved in.
I was very fortunate to go around the world twice because when I went in 1999, I took all four of my children and they had an astonishing time as well.
That's great.
In terms of my projects, I have become interested lately in intractable conflicts, those conflicts that are so knotted that you can't solve them with a 4 hour session of negotiation or mediation, those conflicts that might be bound up with worldviews or religious views, and therefore are simply not amenable to what we might call rational problem solving or logic, because different peoples have different logics or different ideas of what constitutes rationality. And so I'm in a phase of looking back over the work that I've done with Margie Gillis and Dr. Kim Berman and others to understand how can the arts be used, be helpful in intractable conflicts. And I'm sure all of your listeners and both of us can easily think of many intractable conflicts in our midst today. Some of them are political, they're social, they have to do with how we deal with very difficult policy questions. But not only that, they have to do with how we sort out our relationships when a marriage is ending or changing form. They have to do, as you said so wisely, with our own internal conflicts when we're trying very hard to make a decision which might go either way because we have values pointing in both directions at once. And so part of the work that I'm doing these days is really wanting to identify and spread the word about why it is that arts practices are in many ways our most precious resource in conflict. I know that General Romeo Dallaire, former senator here in Canada, is very passionate about this topic. And when he was at UBC some years ago and was asked, having had a front row seat at the Rwandan conflict and genocide, he was asked, is there hope for us as humans? We seem to have a proclivity for conflict. We seem to actually engage in conflict, often destructively, much too often for most people's preferences. And General Dallaire said, we need armies of artists. And he was aware of the contradiction, that in fact he was using a war metaphor and coupling it with artists and artistry. And he said, we need to have these contradictions embedded in the way that we think. And so, with his support and inspired by him and many artists all around the world whose names we don't know because they're working in community, they're working in places with no publicity at all. I've been thinking about how it is that if we focus on issues in conflict, some issue that you and I are arguing over that divides us, it often worsens our relationship and deepens the conflict.
For sure.
As we focus on the rock in the road, we tend to run into that rock in the road. And so I've been thinking a lot about that and about how we really need creativity when we are in an intractable conflict. Yeah,
As you're speaking, and I'm imagining your duties and your life on a day-to-day basis. You teach, you work with organizations, you work with governments, you work with individuals. It takes a very special person who is able to have some sort of equanimity and peace of mind to continue to be at the center of great conflict. So my question is sort of twofold. What do you have any personal creative outlets or projects that aid you personally? And also, how does spirituality play out or play a role in your work?
You know, sometimes those of us who work in conflict as scholar practitioners are in the eye of the storm, and it might feel quite calm in there, but we know that there's a lot of destruction going on around or destructive potential all around us. And so our work is to invoke what the wonderful Irish poet Seamus Heaney talked about. He said, believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and wells and healing cures. So, inspired by Heaney's poetry and by my work in Ireland, I would say that my spirituality is inspired and sustained by that work in Ireland. I had the great good fortune to live in Ireland for part of a year just a few years ago during what they called the Decade of Centenaries. And this was the period spanning from 2012 till about 2022, during which there were many milestones, including the establishment of the Irish Republic and also the involvement of Ireland fighting on the side of the British, their colonizers, in World War One. And so that work in Ireland really helped kindle a sense for me of the importance of spirituality to conflict engagement work. I got very inspired by the Irish decision 4 years ago to hold a national statutory holiday every February 1st in honor of Bridget, who is a Christian, and we might say a post-Christian figure at this point, a figure of unity, someone whose symbols include poetry, smithwork, and grain, who represents female authority. And from Bridget's tradition, I found the term that I love so much, peace weaving, that women in particular have often, always woven the fabric of community together. And so my spirituality very much relates to certainly Christianity and Christian mysticism, and also pre-Christian ways, which with Irish ingenuity have been woven into the fabric of contemporary life.
So those are the things that really sustain you, keep you balanced, but also inspire you to go further. So in terms of, if we're on the thread of inspiration, what have been some of your most transformative moments in your life, experiences involving art and music?
I would say that music in particular has been such an interesting vehicle for learning about conflict. I remember attending a rehearsal of a string quartet at a colleague's home some years
Mhm.
ago and being in complete awe and wonder when I realized that each of those four players had a score and they had to make many, many decisions simultaneously, having to do with all of the dynamics of playing. And yet they had very little verbal interaction, very little verbal negotiation. They literally sensed how they were going to move forward. And then when um, it worked well. And when it didn't, they played again and changed some of those dynamics. One of the things that really surprised me was that my colleague, a professor of music from UBC, gave them very direct feedback. And being someone who has been animated by this metaphor of peace weaving, I found it quite confrontative and quite pointed. And the musicians themselves said they didn't experience that way at all, because perhaps the norms of communication in music performance are different than they might be in the family or commercial mediation and negotiation settings that I've been
They
in.
are.
Indeed. And so this was a great learning. And actually, I would say that one of the effects of it was that in my practice following those experiences, observing string quartet practices, I became slightly more direct. I'm always, however, concerned to leave everyone involved in a negotiation space. So I am concerned not to be too direct in terms of human communication because I want to give people space not to back themselves into a corner. So lots of metaphors here, but I would say that the idea that musicians can create harmony, even otherworldly harmony together without very much verbal communication is a great inspiration because, in fact, it opens up the possibility that perhaps in negotiations or working with a conflict in an organization, it's not necessary to talk through everything. Maybe we need more aesthetic experience together. We need to paint a mural. We need to work with a number of materials. We need to use some aesthetic medium to imagine ourselves into a future together. And so the work with musicians really helped me think about how to work non-verbally with groups. Too often, we're very tied to the verbal. Certainly, people who are legally trained, like myself, are prone to that. We tend to think that everything needs to be verbalized, it needs to be crystallized, it should be written down, and contracts should be drafted. And in fact, many times when I've worked in communities, people have said, it works better for us if we don't write it down because it leaves us more flexibility. It leaves us more ambiguity and more ability to respond to situations as they arise.
And the cool thing about a string quartet, because you mentioned it, there you have a group of people, and often people in groups don't feel that their individuality counts. And the brilliant thing about a string quartet, for example, is that you can take each one of these voices and they have beautiful individual lines, but they each know, or the composer knew, when to kind of quiet this one down, let this one shine a little bit. So it's just, that's a very treasured thing. And yeah, maybe they should invite string quartets to great world leaders, conferences or choirs. Maybe this is not a fair question, but I ask all my guests. If you had to choose 3 or 4 pieces, now it could just be 1 or 2 or 5 or 6, I really don't care, music that you go to for upliftment, what would a mini Michelle LeBaron's playlist look like?
Well, it would involve, I don't know if you know it, it's a piece of music composed for a film called Gabriel's Oboe.
Oh, I certainly do. It's by Ennio Morricone.
Oh, I absolutely love that piece. I would listen to anything from Martin Hayes and Dennis Cahill, who are two Irish musicians, especially their album Welcome Here Again, which is just a wonderful series of renditions of traditional Irish music with some very contemporary twists. I would listen to Noreen Noreen, the wonderful Irish singer, singing the Magnificat, or to Grace Wells, especially another Irish musician, especially her beautiful visual and vocal work on Imbolc, the pagan festival of Imbolc. So those are some.
I like those a lot, and I will definitely list them for the listeners at the end, in the website information, so that they can be uplifted by what you've been uplifted. We seem to be constantly surrounded by conflict and dissonance, to just put another musical term in there. What do you feel the world needs most at this time?
Of course, it's very difficult to identify one thing. Here are some things. I think we need poetry, grain, and smithwork. We need the beauty and the delicacy and the nuance of poetry. We need grain because we all need sustenance. And I'm thinking of the arts as sustenance. And we need smithwork. We need to be able to stand in the fire of conflict. Adi, one of the most inspiring and wonderful things I've ever read about conflict, and certainly the most insightful, was written by a US American potter and artist whose name was M.C. Richards, Mary Catherine Richards, who passed away a few years ago. And she was asked to write a piece about conflict and said, well, I've experienced a lot of conflict in my life, so I'm sure I can do so. Then she found it was actually very difficult because she was trying to avoid the polarities that you and I talked about earlier. She wrote this: in the intricate mesh of our mutual involvement, we befall each other constantly. We get in each other's ways, even when we don't intend to. And that's why we need poetry as Smith work and grain. But I want to also just leave our listeners with one other quote from M.C. Richards, which is one of my very favorite and I think one of the most profound. She said, "Can we imagine a kind of peace that includes the freedom to conflict, a kind of warmth that allows the freedom to withdraw, a kind of union that asks for free and unique individualities, a kind of good that grants the mystery of evil, a kind of life that bears death within it like a seed force." M.C. Richards.
Oh, thank you for leaving us with that. Beautiful, beautiful words. Is it possible? Those are the grand questions. Michelle, it's been an honor, a delight. We could talk for hours and hours. You have been inspiring and uplifting to me, and I hope to our listeners too. So thank you very much in your busy day for finding the time.
Adi, thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm so ignited by your podcast. I think it's a wonderful addition, and I hope a resource that increasing numbers of people will be able to enjoy.
From north to south and east to west, music inhabits every corner of our world and beyond. I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with peace weaver and scholar Michelle Lebaron. I'm Adi BRAUN, and this is Soulscapes.